"Get out of the car," the man ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. The desert sun beat down. Reflecting off the barrel of the gun, he now pointed in their direction. With no choice, Marissa and David complied, stepping out into the hot desert air with their hands raised. 2 other men surrounded their vehicle, their faces grim and set. Their search for answers, for the daughters they had lost 20 years ago, had led them straight into the lion's den. As the gates of the isolated ranch creaked open behind them, a chilling question hung in the air. Had they just found the truth, or had they found their grave? If you are new to this channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like this video and comment where you are watching from. The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a wave of sound that vibrated through the polished floor of the gymnasium and up into the soles of their sneakers. For the Chandler High School cheerleading squad, it was the sound of victory. Confetti cannons had just erupted, showering the air with shimmering silver and red streamers that now clung to their sweat-dampened hair and uniforms. They hadn't won first place. A technically flawless but soulless team from Scottsdale had claimed that honor, but their second-place trophy felt heavier, more earned. Their routine had been electric, a fusion of raw energy and precision that had brought the entire arena to its feet. At the heart of that energy were the Green twins, April and Amber. At 14, they were a study in complementary contrasts. April, the flyer, was all focused grace, her movements in the air as deliberate and beautiful as a hawk on the wind. Amber, a base, was the powerhouse, her infectious grin a beacon of strength and spirit that anchored the entire squad. They were inseparable, their bond a silent language of shared glances and twinned instincts. "We did it! I can't believe we did it!" Amber screamed, grabbing April in a fierce, breathless hug as they huddled with their 4 teammates. Kira, Hannah, Rachel, and Lily. Their coach, Vincent Caraway, a man whose intense coaching style was matched only by his devotion to his girls, beamed at them, his eyes shining with pride under the harsh gymnasium lights. "I knew you had it in you," he'd said, his voice hoarse from shouting encouragement. "You left it all on the mat. All of you." An hour later, buzzing with adrenaline and sugar from celebratory sodas, April and Amber piled into the team van with the others and made the call home. Marissa answered on the 3rd ring, putting the phone on speaker so David could hear. "Mom, Dad, we got second." Amber's voice crackled through the line, layered with the excited chatter of the other girls in the background. "Oh, sweethearts, that's incredible," Marissa exclaimed, her heart swelling with a pride so fierce it almost hurt. David's deeper voice rumbled his congratulations, telling them how proud he was. "The trophy is huge," April added, her voice a bit calmer but no less thrilled. "It's a little gaudy, but we love it. We're just leaving the arena now. We're gonna drop off a few of the girls, so we'll probably be home in about an hour, maybe a little more." "Okay, drive safe," David said, the familiar parental caution tempering his excitement. "We'll leave the porch light on for you." "We will. Love you," they chorused. "We love you too," Marissa replied, and the line went dead, leaving a smiling silence in the kitchen. That silence was the last moment of peace they would know for 2 decades. The first hour passed easily. Marissa tidied the kitchen, while David watched the late news. When the clock on the mantel chimed midnight, a flicker of annoyance stirred in Marissa. Teenagers and their perception of time. She pictured them stopping for celebratory burgers, losing track of the minutes in a flurry of laughter and gossip. By 1 o'clock, the annoyance had curdled into a knot of unease. She began to pace the living room, her shadow stretching long and thin in the light from the porch. "They should have at least called," she murmured, peering out the front window into the empty, sleeping street. "They're probably fine, Mar," David said, though he had muted the television, his own focus now entirely on the silence of the house. At 1:30, Marissa could bear it no longer. She called Linda Thompson, Kira's mother. Linda's voice was thick with sleep when she answered, but it sharpened instantly with alarm when she heard Marissa's question. "No," Linda said, a frantic edge creeping into her tone. "No, Kira's not home yet. I I thought maybe they were having a sleepover at your place." That single conversation was the spark that ignited a firestorm of panic. A frantic chain of phone calls lit up the night across Chandler. Each call was a new verse in the same terrifying chorus. No one had seen them. No one had heard from them. 6 girls and their coach had driven away from a brightly lit gymnasium and vanished into the dark Arizona night. By 3 in the morning, the Greens' living room had become an impromptu command center, filled with the murmur of police radios and the hollow-eyed faces of other parents. The initial report of a missing van had escalated into a full-scale search. The night dragged on, each minute an eternity of imagined horrors. Just before dawn, the call came. A state trooper on a routine patrol had found it. The team van was parked on the shoulder of a desolate stretch of the Beeline Highway, miles from any of the girls' homes. The hazard lights were off, the engine cold. David and Marissa arrived at the scene to a chilling tableau, bathed in the sterile, flashing red and blue of police lights. The van's side door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the morning breeze. Inside, everything was just as the girls had left it. A half-eaten bag of chips lay on a seat. Discarded pom-poms littered the floor like fallen birds. And on the dashboard, lined up in a neat row, were 6 purses, their phones silent within, their cash and IDs untouched. There was no sign of a struggle. No broken glass, no blood, no note. There was only an overwhelming, deafening absence. 6 vibrant, laughing teenage girls had been plucked from the world, leaving behind only these mundane relics of a life that had, in an instant, been terrifyingly interrupted. The night of triumph had become the dawn of an unending nightmare. The frantic energy of that first week was a blur of motion and noise that stood in stark contrast to the silence that would follow. Search parties, thousands strong, combed the unforgiving expanse of the Sonoran Desert, their brightly colored vests a fleeting, hopeful stain against the muted browns and greens of the landscape. News vans lined their street, turning their private agony into a public spectacle. Their faces, and the smiling school pictures of their daughters, were broadcast across the nation. They answered the same questions 1,000 times, their voices growing hoarse, their story becoming a script they recited from a place outside their own bodies. Every phone call, every knock at the door, carried the potential for either miraculous news or unbearable finality. But the miracle never came. The weeks bled into months. The search parties dwindled, the volunteers returning to their own lives, their own children. The news cycle moved on to fresher tragedies. The police, though sympathetic, had exhausted every lead. There were no witnesses, no credible ransom notes, no forensic evidence to point them in any direction. The case was a perfect vacuum. The initial, sharp-edged panic slowly cooled into a chronic, soul-deep ache, the specific agony of ambiguous loss. Their daughters weren't gone in a way the world could understand. They simply were not there. They existed in a quantum state between life and death, and their parents were trapped in that agonizing space with them. 20 years later, the Arizona sun streamed through the same kitchen window, but the light felt different now. It seemed to illuminate not a home, but a museum of a life that had been. Upstairs, the girls' rooms remained almost exactly as they had left them. April's was neat, her books on astronomy and dance stacked precisely on her desk. Amber's was a chaotic explosion of posters, clothes, and art supplies. For the first few years, Marissa had kept them pristine, dusting the surfaces and washing the bedding as if expecting the girls to walk through the door at any moment. Now, a fine layer of dust coated everything, a testament to a hope she no longer had the strength to maintain. The rooms were no longer waiting. They were shrines. The passage of time was marked by a series of painful anniversaries. Their birthday in March was a day of quiet, shared grief. May 17th, the anniversary of the disappearance, was a gaping wound that reopened with brutal predictability each year. They watched their friends' children graduate, get married, have babies. Each milestone was a phantom limb, a painful reminder of a future that had been stolen from them. The world moved on, relentlessly, while Marissa and David remained anchored to that single, terrible night in 1995. This morning was no different. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, broken only by the clink of Marissa's spoon against her coffee mug and the rustle of the newspaper in David's hands. He had retreated into a fortress of stoicism over the years, his grief a quiet, simmering thing beneath a placid surface. But she saw it in the permanent clench of his jaw, in the way his knuckles were white as he gripped the paper. Her own grief was more porous. It seeped into everything. Her thoughts, as they often did, drifted to the what-ifs. The girls would be 34. 34. The number felt alien, impossible. She tried to picture their faces, to age the bright-eyed 14-year-olds in the photo on the refrigerator. But the image always dissolved. Would April have become a dancer? Would Amber's art have filled galleries? These questions were a form of self-torture she couldn't stop. They had learned to live with the not knowing, but it was a half-life, a fragile scaffolding of routine built around a cavernous, empty space. They ate breakfast. They went to work. They paid their bills. They performed a pantomime of normalcy. But the truth was they were ghosts in their own home, haunted by the twin specters of the daughters they had lost. The silence of the house wasn't peace. It was the sound of a story that had stopped mid-sentence, waiting for an ending that would never come. The sudden, violent vibration of Marissa's phone against the wooden table was an assault. It was a sound from the outside world, a world they had long tried to keep at a muted distance. She glanced down, her mind already cycling through the short list of possibilities. A work colleague with an early morning question. Perhaps one of her friends from the grief support group, the only people who truly understood the topography of their sorrow. The name that illuminated the screen, however, belonged to none of them. It was a name dredged up from the deepest, most turbulent waters of their past. Detective Holbrook. The breath caught in her throat. For a dizzying second, she was 20 years younger, sitting in a cold, sterile interrogation room. The detective's face a mask of professional sympathy as he promised he would do everything in his power. He was a ghost, a symbol of a time when hope was a frantic, desperate thing, before it had withered and died on the vine. His name was the embodiment of the investigation that had consumed their lives and ultimately yielded nothing but cold, empty silence. "David," she said, her voice a reedy whisper that was nearly swallowed by the quiet of the room. "It's Detective Holbrook." David's head snapped up from his newspaper, the paper crinkling in his grip. His eyes, which had been listlessly scanning the day's headlines, were now wide with a stark, naked disbelief. She saw the same cascade of memories she had just experienced flash across his face. The press conferences, the fruitless searches, the final, pitying handshake when the case was officially moved to the cold case files. "Answer it," David urged, his voice tight. He set down his coffee mug with a hand that trembled so violently the ceramic rattled against the saucer. Marissa swiped to accept the call, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She immediately placed it on speaker, a silent, instinctual act. Whatever this was, they would hear it together. "Hello, Mrs. Green." Detective Holbrook's deep voice resonated through the phone, older now, rougher around the edges, but still unmistakable. "I hope I'm not disturbing your morning." "Not at all," Marissa replied, amazed her voice worked at all. Is everything okay?" There was a measured pause on the other end, a silence that stretched for an eternity. "We have a significant update about your daughter's case," the detective said. He delivered the line without inflection, but the undercurrent of urgency was a palpable force, a current that seemed to travel through the phone and seize her insides. "What kind of update?" she asked, her voice finally breaking, the carefully constructed dam of her composure cracking under the impossible weight of those words. "After 20 years of silence, have you found?" "I can't explain everything over the phone," Detective Holbrook interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "Could you and your husband come down to the station? The sooner the better." David leaned forward, his face a mask of tension. "We'll be there immediately," he assured the detective, his voice strained but clear. "Thank you. I'll be waiting." The call ended. The click of the disconnection was as loud as a gunshot in the silent kitchen. For a full minute, neither of them moved. They were frozen, suspended in a fragile, terrifying moment of possibility. A hope so dangerous and unfamiliar was swelling within Marissa that she was afraid to breathe, afraid that any sudden action might shatter it into a million pieces. "Do you think?" she began, but couldn't finish the question. She couldn't give voice to the hope that was clawing its way up her throat. David reached across the table and squeezed her hand, his grip grounding her. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," he said, though his eyes betrayed the same wild hope flickering in her own heart. "But whatever it is, we'll face it together." That was the signal. The spell was broken. They rose from the table with a surge of newfound energy, abandoning their half-eaten breakfast. Their morning routine, their 20-year-old pantomime of normalcy, was obliterated. This was something new. This was a deviation from the script of their grief. As they drove toward the Chandler Police Department, the familiar city streets looked alien, as if seen for the first time. They were driving toward a precipice, with no idea if they were about to find a bridge to their daughters, or fall into an even deeper abyss. The Chandler Police Department had not changed. It smelled of the same institutional trinity: stale coffee, industrial disinfectant, and the faint, metallic tang of anxiety. As Marissa and David walked down the hall, the linoleum floors seemed to absorb the sound of their footsteps, muffling them into a funereal quiet. The receptionist had recognized them immediately, her practiced, sympathetic smile a painful reminder of how many times they had walked this same path 2 decades ago. She directed them to a conference room, and with every step, Marissa felt the years peeling away, leaving her skin raw and exposed to the ghosts of the past. When they entered, they found they were the last to arrive. The 4 other sets of parents were already seated around a long, polished table, a silent, grim assembly. They were members of a terrible, exclusive club, bound by a shared, unending grief. Marissa's gaze met that of Linda Thompson, and in that single, shared look, 20 years of unspoken sorrow, of shared vigils and failed hopes, passed between them. The others, the Lees, the Collins, the Riveras, looked just as they felt, older, worn down by the relentless friction of time, yet electrified now with a new and terrifying energy. The air in the room was brittle, a fragile silence stretched taut over a chasm of desperate hope and profound dread. Detective Holbrook stood at the front of the room, a folder resting on the table before him. He, too, was a map of the intervening years. The once dark hair was now more salt than pepper, and the lines around his eyes were carved deeper, as if he personally carried the weight of every unsolved case. He acknowledged them with a solemn nod. "Mr. and Mrs. Green, please have a seat." As they settled into the remaining chairs, the silence in the room returned, thick and expectant. Detective Holbrook cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. "Thank you all for coming so quickly," he began, his eyes moving slowly from one parental pair to the next, holding their gaze. "As I mentioned on the phone, we have a significant development in your daughter's case." He let the words hang in the air, allowing the magnitude of the statement to settle. This was not a false alarm. This was not another dead-end tip from a psychic. This was real. "Early this morning," he continued, his voice steady, "a hiker, deep in a remote section of the Sonoran Desert, discovered something we believe is directly connected to your daughter's disappearance." He turned to a laptop on the table and clicked a few keys. The quiet whir of a projector fan filled the room as a beam of light hit the wall screen. An image flickered into focus, and a sharp, collective intake of breath swept through the room. It was a photograph of a metal suitcase, its surface ravaged by the angry orange of deep rust, half swallowed by the pale desert sand. It lay beneath a large, flat stone, as if hastily concealed. The lid was slightly ajar, and from within spilled a ghostly pile of red and white fabric. Cheerleading uniforms. Susan Collins, Rachel's mother, whispered, her hand flying to her mouth as a sob escaped her. Marissa leaned forward, her eyes locked on the image, her heart hammering against her ribs. The red fabric, though dusty and faded by the harsh digital flash of the camera, was unmistakable. She could see the white trim, the bold block lettering of the school logo. They were the uniforms, the very ones her daughters had worn with such pride on their last night. But as she stared, a cold, analytical thought cut through her shock. For something buried in the desert for 20 years, they looked too preserved, too neat. A disquieting sense of wrongness settled over her. This discovery was not just a relic of the past. It felt like a message sent in the present. There was no debate. A silent, unanimous consensus formed in the sterile conference room. They had to go. They had to see the place where this piece of their past had been unearthed. Detective Holbrook, seeing the fierce, unyielding determination in their eyes, relented. The convoy of vehicles left Chandler under the late morning sun, a silent, sorrowful parade moving toward the desolate horizon. Detective Holbrook's unmarked police car led the way, with 5 civilian vehicles trailing behind, each carrying parents suspended between the hope of answers and the terror of what those answers might be. Marissa stared out the passenger window, watching the familiar landscape of her life. The shopping centers, the manicured suburbs, the new buildings her daughters would never recognize, gradually dissolve. The city's edges frayed, giving way to the sparse, hardy scrub of the Sonoran Desert. The endless expanse of rock and sand felt like a physical representation of the last 20 years. Vast, empty, and concealing its secrets under a harsh, unforgiving sun. David drove in tense silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his focus absolute. They were no longer waiting. They were moving toward something. By the time they reached the desert site, the sun was high and merciless, casting sharp, stark shadows across the rugged terrain. They parked in a makeshift lot beside the official police vehicles. The sight of a white forensic tent and the bright yellow of crime scene tape an unnatural intrusion on the ancient landscape. It created a sacred, forbidden space in the middle of nowhere. They followed Detective Holbrook on foot for what felt like miles, a somber pilgrimage across the hard-packed earth. As they approached, they saw a man standing off to the side with a medium-sized dog on a leash. He had sun-weathered skin and kind, weary eyes that held a hint of apology, as if he were sorry to be the one to drag them back into this nightmare. "This is Chris Delaney," Detective Holbrook said, "the man who found the suitcase. And that's his dog, Dusty." Chris stepped forward, extending his hand to each of them in turn. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances," he said, his voice quiet and respectful. "Thank you," Marissa told him, her own voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "You have no idea what this means to us." Chris nodded, his gaze somber. "Dusty deserves most of the credit. He caught a scent and just wouldn't leave it alone. Started digging like his life depended on it." The dog, an intelligent-looking shepherd mix, sat obediently at his owner's feet, panting in the heat. Detective Holbrook led them under the canvas shelter of the tent, where the rusted suitcase now sat on a folding table. The uniforms were laid out beside it. The red and white fabric, though showing signs of age and exposure, was still vibrant. They were neatly folded. A forensic technician in a white jumpsuit stood nearby. "Based on the condition of the uniforms and the suitcase itself," the tech explained, his voice clinical, "we believe they were buried here relatively recently, perhaps within the last year or so." The words dropped into the stunned silence of the tent. "Recently?" Peter Rivera, Lily's father, questioned, his voice sharp with confusion. "But our daughters disappeared 20 years ago. That's what makes this discovery so unusual," Detective Holbrook admitted gravely. "It appears that whoever hid these did so in a hurry." As the parents gathered around the table, trying to process this baffling new timeline, Marissa noticed movement in the distance. A dust plume was rising from the dirt track, kicked up by 2 approaching vehicles. One was a news van. The other was a sedan that looked vaguely familiar. When it parked and its driver stepped out, Marissa felt a jolt of recognition that was both comforting and strangely unsettling. Vincent Carraway, the girls' former cheerleading coach, strode toward them with the same purposeful, athletic gait she remembered. He had aged, but he carried himself with an unchanged air of authority. "Marissa, David," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the dry air. I came as soon as I heard." He moved among the parents, a figure of strength and shared history, shaking hands and offering gentle touches on the shoulder. When he reached the table, he stared down at the uniforms, his expression unreadable. "After all these years," he murmured, his voice laced with what sounded like profound sadness. "I never stopped hoping." Use arrow up and arrow down to select a turn, enter to jump to it, and escape to return to the chat. A wave of claustrophobia washed over Marissa. The small tent, filled with the ghosts of the past and the clinical presence of forensic technicians, suddenly felt suffocating. The arrival of the media, their cameras like vultures circling a kill, had set her teeth on edge. And then there was Caraway, his familiar face a disorienting anchor to a time she wanted to both remember and forget. It was all too much. The air was too thick, the emotions too raw. She needed to escape, even for a moment. "I left my water bottle in the car," she murmured to David, the excuse forming on her lips before she had fully thought it through. "And my good camera. My phone won't capture enough detail of this place." It was a flimsy pretext, but it was enough. She felt a desperate need to document this place, to capture it with a proper lens, as if somehow trapping it in an image would give her a measure of control. "I'll come with you," David offered immediately, sensing her need to flee. They approached Detective Holbrook, who was now in a low, intense conversation with Coach Caraway. "That's fine," the detective said, his attention momentarily diverted. He fixed them with a stern look. "But stay on the path we came in on. It's easy to get disoriented out here, and we don't need any more missing persons today." They nodded and began the walk back toward the makeshift parking area. The midday sun was a physical weight pressing down on them. Heat rose in shimmering, visible waves from the baked earth. As they walked, Marissa scanned the surrounding landscape, the vast, silent emptiness of the desert stretching to every horizon. It was a place that could swallow secrets whole. And then she saw it. Far in the distance, partially obscured by a low ridge and the shimmering heat haze, was a truck. It was too far from any trail for casual hikers. Her eyes narrowed. There were figures moving around it, their forms distorted by the heat. One seemed to be dragging something heavy and dark toward the vehicle, while the other was crouched behind a large saguaro cactus near a cluster of rocks, rhythmically moving as if digging. "David," she whispered, her voice tight, touching his arm to stop him. "Look, over there." He followed her gaze, squinting against the blinding sun. "I see them. What are they doing all the way out here?" "Something's not right," Marissa said, her maternal instinct, honed by 20 years of hypervigilance, screaming at her. Why would they be digging? Why would they run if they saw us? She didn't wait for David's response. Veering off the path, she began walking directly toward the distant truck, her pace quickening with a sudden, fierce purpose. "Marissa," David hissed, hurrying after her. "What are you doing?" The detective said to stay on the path. "This is dangerous. By the time we get back to him, they could be gone," she argued, not breaking her stride. "Something is telling me this has to do with our girls. I can feel it." As they drew closer, the men by the truck noticed them. The reaction was immediate and explosive. They shouted to each other in alarm, their movements becoming frantic and panicked. The man who had been dragging the heavy sack heaved it into the truck bed. The other scrambled up from behind the rocks, a shovel glinting in his hands, and rushed toward the cab. Within seconds, the truck's engine roared to life. It tore away from the spot, kicking up a massive cloud of dust that obscured it from view. "Did you see that?" Marissa exclaimed, her heart pounding. They ran, driven by an unstoppable compulsion. She walked toward the spot where the men had been. "Marissa, we need to go back," David urged, following reluctantly. "Just a little farther," she insisted. "I need to see." When they reached the large cactus and the nearby rocks, the evidence of the men's activity was clear. There was a freshly dug hole in the sand, similar in size to the one where the suitcase had been found, but this one was now empty. David knelt beside it, scanning the disturbed earth. "There's something here," he said suddenly, his voice hushed. He reached into the loose sand at the edge of the hole and pulled out a small, metallic object, brushing away the dust that clung to it. He held it out on his palm. Marissa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a cry. A wave of vertigo washed over her, the desert landscape tilting around her. "Oh my God, David," she breathed, her voice trembling as she took the object. "That's Amber's earring." Though tarnished by time and earth, there was no mistaking the distinctive design. A tiny silver star with a single red gem at its center. A matched set. A gift she had given both her daughters for their 13th birthday, just months before they were stolen from her. It was a tangible piece of her child, unearthed from a secret hole in the desert, and the men who had just fled had been the ones to dig it up. The walk back to the forensic tent was a frantic, breathless scramble. The desert, which had felt vast and empty moments before, now seemed alive with unseen threats. Every rustle in the scrub brush, every shadow cast by a distant butte, felt menacing. Marissa clutched the small, tarnished earring in her palm as if it were a holy relic, the metal a burning ember of truth against her skin. It was more than a clue. It was a piece of amber, a voice calling out from across a 20-year silence, and she would not let it go. David's hand hovered protectively over her shoulder, a silent gesture of support as they hurried back toward the yellow crime scene tape. They burst back into the relative cool of the tent, their ragged breathing and wild-eyed expressions immediately silencing the low conversations. "Detective," Marissa called out, her voice sharp with urgency. "We need to speak with you, right now." Detective Holbrook, who had been speaking with a technician, turned, his expression shifting from professional focus to immediate concern at the sight of their faces. "What happened? I told you to stay on the path." "We found something," David explained, his voice tight as he gestured for Marissa to show him. She held out her palm, revealing the tarnished piece of jewelry. "This is Amber's earring. I'm certain of it. I gave identical pairs to both girls for their 13th birthday." The detective's frown deepened into a scowl of paternal anger. "Where did you find this?" Before they could answer, he pressed on, his voice low and sharp. "You went after those men, didn't you? In a remote desert location? Do you have any idea how reckless, how dangerous that was?" "We know," David acknowledged, his tone firm. "But they were getting away. They were digging, detective, in a hole just like the one where the suitcase was found. When they saw us, they fled. These might be the guys who buried the suitcase," Marissa added quickly, her words tumbling out. "They could have been checking their hiding spots after hearing the police were here. They might be getting rid of other evidence right now." By now, the other parents had gathered around them, their faces a mixture of fear and electrifying hope. Vincent Caraway pushed through the small crowd, his expression grave. "What's going on?" he asked, his gaze flicking between Marissa and the detective. Holbrook held up the earring, now pinched carefully between his thumb and forefinger. "The Greens found this. Mrs. Green believes it belonged to her daughter, Amber." Caraway's eyes widened slightly as he looked at the jewelry. "That does look like the earrings the girls used to wear," he confirmed, his voice lending an air of authority to their claim. "Did you get a good look at these men?" Holbrook asked, his anger now completely eclipsed by the sharp focus of an investigator who has just caught a scent. "It was too far to see their faces clearly," David admitted, "but I did notice a company logo on the truck's rear window." "A logo?" The detective reached for his notepad. "Did you recognize it?" Marissa shook her head in frustration. "Not clearly. It was moving too fast. But I tried to sketch it." She took the notepad and pen Holbrook offered, her hand trembling as she tried to recreate the fleeting image. Felt like trying to draw a memory. After a moment, she handed it back, a crude drawing of a bird-like shape encircling 3 letters. It was something like this. A stylized bird, maybe a phoenix, with its wings around the letters C, P, and F. A sharp gasp came from beside her. It was Linda Thompson. She stepped forward, her face pale. "CPF," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the desert air like a razor. "That sounds like Caraway Performance and Fitness Group." A sudden, profound silence descended upon the tent. The only sounds were the desert wind flapping against the canvas and the distant hum of a police generator. Every eye in the small, crowded space, parents, officers, technicians, swung and locked onto one man, Vincent Carraway. The police investigation at the desert site settled into a slow, methodical rhythm that Marissa found unbearable. Officers were casting tire tracks, expanding the search grid, and bagging every potential fiber of evidence. It was necessary, professional work, but to Marissa, it felt like watching a clock tick in slow motion while a fire raged in the next room. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the desert was beginning to curdle into a restless, vibrating anxiety. She couldn't just stand there and wait. "We should eat something," David suggested, his voice low and gentle as he guided her away from the chaotic scene. "It could be hours before we hear anything from Detective Holbrook, and we need to keep our strength up." Marissa nodded absently, the thought of food repulsive, but she understood his logic. They were running on fumes, a volatile cocktail of adrenaline, terror, and a hope so fragile it felt like glass. They drove in their airless capsule of a car, the silence broken only by the crunch of gravel as they pulled into the parking lot of a remote, sun-bleached diner. It was a dusty patch of gravel with a few pickup trucks scattered about. A neon open sign buzzed fitfully in the window, a lonely beacon of welcome in the vast emptiness. Inside, the diner was a cool, dim refuge from the desert's glare. It had a timeless, small-town charm, with cracked red vinyl booths, a long counter with spinning stools, and the comforting smell of coffee and grilled onions hanging in the air. A few locals sat at the counter, their quiet conversations a low murmur in the background. Marissa and David chose a booth in the back corner, a private space where they could try to process the seismic shifts of the past few hours. A middle-aged waitress approached, a pot of coffee in one hand and two menus in the other. She greeted them with a warm, tired smile and filled their cups before taking their order. A club sandwich for David, a bowl of soup Marissa knew she wouldn't touch. "I can't believe we found it," Marissa said finally, her voice low, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug for its warmth. "Amber's earring. After all this time. It can't be a coincidence, David." "I know," he said, his own voice strained. "But we have to let the police do their job now, Marissa. Those men are dangerous." "But what if the police don't find them?" she countered, leaning forward, her eyes intense. "What if they get away? We saw their truck, David. We should go back to where we saw them and follow the trail ourselves." "That's crazy, and you know it," he said, keeping his voice low but firm. "The police have resources, training. Rushing off into the desert on our own won't help April and Amber." "Does it?" Marissa's voice was laced with the bitterness of 2 decades of disappointment. "It's been 20 years, and they found nothing. A random hiker and his dog found that suitcase. We found the earring. What does that tell you about how thorough the police have been?" Their tense debate was interrupted by the return of the waitress with their food. As she set the plates down with practiced efficiency, she tucked a strand of loose hair behind her ear, and Marissa froze. The world seemed to slow, the background noise of the diner fading to a dull hum. Her entire consciousness narrowed to a single, impossible point of light. On the woman's earlobe, glinting in the dim light of the diner, was a flash of silver, a tiny star with a single red gem at its center. It was the other one, the pair to the earring clutched in an evidence bag miles away. "Excuse me," Marissa said, her voice strained, unrecognizable to her own ears. "That earring you're wearing, could I ask? Where did you get it?" The waitress seemed surprised by the intensely personal question, but not alarmed. She touched the earring self-consciously. "This old thing? A customer gave it to me years ago. Said it matched my eyes." She smiled faintly at the memory. "It's missing its pair, though. He said it got lost somewhere, but he let me keep this one." David, who had followed Marissa's stunned gaze, now stared at the earring with the same thunderstruck recognition. "Was the customer a local?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. The waitress considered it. "Not sure if he lives around here, but I've seen him a few times over the years. He's a friend of Gerald Laffinger, who lives on a ranch about 10 miles from here. She gestured toward a corkboard on the wall covered with photos. He's on our customer wall somewhere. Then she checked her watch. In fact, I'm due to make Mr. Laffinger's daily catering delivery in about 20 minutes. Marissa and David exchanged a look, a silent, lightning-fast communication. The name, the ranch, the delivery, it was a constellation of clues, a map laid out before them. In the heart of the desolate Arizona desert, in a Greasy Spoon diner, they had just found their next step. The waitress, whose name they learned was Sarah, was wary. Giving out a customer's personal information could cost her the only job she had in a 50-mile radius. But as Marissa and David laid out the story, the 20-year nightmare, the suitcase in the sand, the identical earring found in a freshly dug hole, Sarah's skepticism melted away, replaced by a look of horrified compassion. She couldn't give them the address directly, she said, her voice wavering. But she couldn't control who drove on public roads, could she? The unspoken invitation hung in the air, a dangerous and irresistible offer. They paid their bill, leaving a generous tip for a meal they hadn't touched, their minds racing. As they walked out into the blinding afternoon sun, David spotted a familiar figure at the gas station across the street. Chris Delaney, the hiker, filling the tank of his pickup truck while his dog, Dusty, watched from the passenger seat. There was no time to connect, no time to explain. The side door of the diner opened, and Sarah emerged, loading several large, insulated bags onto the back of a small delivery motorcycle. She caught Marissa's eye for a fleeting, significant second, then looked away as she secured the bags and climbed onto the bike. "Let's go," Marissa whispered, sliding into the passenger seat of their car. David started the engine, his hands steady on the wheel despite the tremor she could feel running through him. He waited until the motorcycle pulled out onto the road, then followed, keeping a discreet, careful distance. The car was an island of tense silence in the vast, indifferent desert. Every mile that unspooled before them felt like a step deeper into unknown territory, a journey off the edge of the map of their lives. The blacktop shimmered with heat, the landscape on either side a monotonous blur of creosote and saguaro. After about 15 minutes that felt like an eternity, the motorcycle's brake lights flashed. Sarah turned onto a rough, unmarked dirt road, a plume of dust billowing behind her. A weathered wooden sign, nearly reclaimed by the desert, was posted at the turnoff, Laffinger Ranch, private property. David drove past the entrance, continuing for another quarter mile before pulling over onto a small rise that was partially shielded by a cluster of Palo Verde trees. From here, they had a clear, if distant, view of the ranch's entrance. The property was an unnerving fortress in the middle of nowhere. A high, wrought iron fence, topped with menacing-looking spikes, surrounded the entire perimeter. Security cameras were mounted like silent sentinels on the massive gate posts. Beyond the fence, they could see several buildings. A large, sprawling main house built in a Spanish style, a couple of smaller structures that might be guest houses or barracks, and what looked like horse stables in the distance. The place radiated an aura of wealth, paranoia, and isolation. They watched through the shimmering heat as Sarah parked her motorcycle by the gate. A uniformed security guard emerged from a small guardhouse and took the catering order from her. The size of the delivery was staggering, far more food than a single ranch owner and a few hands would need. It was enough to feed a small army. What kind of ranch needs catering for dozens of people every day? David wondered aloud, voicing the same uneasy question that was screaming in Marissa's mind. After a few minutes, Sarah retrieved her empty delivery bags, climbed back onto her motorcycle, and drove away, disappearing down the dirt road in a cloud of dust, leaving them alone with the silent, formidable ranch. "Should we call Holbrook?" David asked, his hand hovering over his phone. "And tell him what?" Marissa countered, her gaze fixed on the gate. "That we have a hunch? That a waitress got an earring from a friend of the owner? He'd tell us to stay put. He'd tell us to wait." And waiting was a luxury she could no longer afford. As they debated their next move, the heavy iron gate to the ranch creaked open. A rugged, dark blue Jeep rolled out. Marissa's breath caught in her throat. Inside were 3 men. Their clothes, their hats, the menacing set of their shoulders. She recognized them instantly. They were the men from the desert. "That's them," she hissed, instinctively ducking down in her seat. "David, that's them." David tensed as the Jeep approached, driving past their parked car and onto the main road. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, as the vehicles passed each other, Marissa locked eyes with one of the men in the back seat. There was a flicker of recognition in his cold, dark eyes, a dawning awareness that twisted into a scowl. "They saw us," she whispered, her heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. "We need to leave. Now." David slammed the car into drive and pulled back onto the road, heading away from the ranch. But in the rearview mirror, he could see the Jeep's brake lights flash. It slowed, then began a wide, deliberate U-turn, its tires spitting gravel. It was coming after them. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Marissa. "Drive faster, David," she urged, her voice tight with fear. She twisted in her seat to look behind them. The blue Jeep was no longer following. It was hunting. It closed the distance between them with predatory speed, its large, aggressive grille filling their rearview mirror, a monster chewing up the desolate road behind them. David pressed the accelerator, the engine of their sensible family sedan whining in protest, but it was a futile effort. They were a deer fleeing a wolf pack, their car no match for the Jeep's powerful engine and off-road tires on the rough desert blacktop. Within minutes, the Jeep was on their bumper. It swerved violently into the oncoming lane, pulling alongside them. Marissa could see the grim, set faces of the men inside, their expressions devoid of anything but cold purpose. The driver gestured with his hand in a sharp, downward motion, an unmistakable command to pull over. When David hesitated, the Jeep swerved toward them, forcing him to wrench the wheel to avoid a collision that would have sent them spinning into the desert scrub. The message was clear. They could stop or they would be stopped. David slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming in protest as the car skidded to a halt in a cloud of dust and the smell of burning rubber. The Jeep screeched to a stop directly in front of them, blocking their path completely. Before the dust had even settled, the Jeep's doors flew open, and the 3 men stepped out. Simultaneously, Marissa's blood ran cold as she saw 2 more vehicles, a large pickup and another SUV, emerging from the ranch gate in the distance, speeding toward them like reinforcements arriving for a battle. They were trapped, pincered between the vehicles on an empty road with nowhere to run. "David?" Marissa breathed, her hand gripping his arm, fear a physical vice around her throat. "What do we do?" But it was too late for escape. The men surrounded their car, their movements practiced and efficient. One of them, a thick-set man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, rapped his knuckles sharply on David's window. "Get out of the car," he ordered, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, leaving no room for argument. With no choice, their hands raised in a gesture of surrender, Marissa and David complied. They stepped out into the oppressive heat, the desert sun beating down on them as the men quickly and impersonally searched them, confiscating their phones and wallets. The distant whine of the approaching vehicles grew louder. "Who are you and why are you watching the ranch?" another man demanded, his hand resting casually on the butt of a gun holstered at his hip. Marissa straightened her spine, a mother's desperation forging a sliver of courage in the face of her terror. "My name is Marissa Green. This is my husband, David," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "We're looking for our daughters who disappeared 20 years ago. We have reason to believe someone at this ranch might have information about them." The men exchanged unreadable glances. The first man spoke into a radio clipped to his shirt, his voice a low, clipped monotone. "We have the couple from the desert. They say they're looking for missing daughters. Awaiting instructions." A moment of static-filled silence followed. Then a voice, distorted and metallic, crackled through the radio. "Bring them in." The newly arrived vehicles skidded to a stop, boxing them in completely. Surrounded by the silent, Imposing men with no chance of escape, Marissa and David were escorted into the back of one of the SUVs. The doors shut with a heavy, final thud, sealing them in darkness and the sterile smell of air conditioning. As the vehicle turned and drove through the now open gates of Laffinger Ranch, Marissa couldn't decide whether to feel terrified or hopeful. Their search for answers had led them straight into the lion's den. And as the gates closed behind them, a chilling question hung in the air. Had they just found the truth, or had they found their grave? They were led not into the opulent main house, but across a stretch of open yard toward a large, cavernous horse barn that stood apart from the other buildings. The air inside was thick with the sweet, earthy smell of hay and animal sweat, a scent of life that felt grotesquely out of place. But there were no horses. The stalls were empty, covered in a thick layer of dust. The men led them to what looked like a small supply closet at the rear of the building, its door scarred and weathered. One of them swung it open to reveal not shelves of supplies, but a steep, narrow staircase plunging down into darkness. "Move!" he ordered, shoving David forward. They descended into the earth, the air growing cooler and damper with each concrete step. The smell of hay was replaced by the cold, sterile scent of concrete and mildew. At the bottom was another door, this one made of heavy, reinforced steel, with a complex electronic keypad glowing beside it. One of the men punched in a code, and the door swung inward with a heavy, pneumatic hiss, revealing what could only be described as an underground bunker. The space was shockingly large and brutally utilitarian. Long fluorescent tubes hummed overhead, casting a flat, shadowless light on the windowless concrete walls and floor. Several cots with thin mattresses and gray blankets were lined up against one wall. A small, primitive kitchenette was tucked into one corner, and a partial wall sectioned off a crude bathroom area. It was a prison built for long-term confinement. But it was not the room that seized Marissa's attention. It was the occupants, sitting on the cots, watching their entrance with wary, haunted eyes, were three women. They appeared to be in their early 30s, their frames thin and their skin possessing a pale, almost translucent quality that spoke of years without sunlight. They were clean and seemed physically unharmed, but their eyes told a story of unimaginable horror. They were the eyes of ghosts who were still breathing. The men forced Marissa and David to their knees in the center of the room, roughly binding their hands to a thick metal pipe that ran from the floor to the ceiling. Without another word, they turned and left, the heavy steel door closing behind them with a resounding, echoing thud. The finality of that sound was absolute. They were entombed. For a long, silent moment, Marissa and David struggled to process what they were seeing. The age of the women, it was the right age. A wild, terrifying hope, so powerful it felt like pain, surged through Marissa. Could it be? Before either of them could speak, heavy footsteps descended the stairs again. The door hissed open, and Gerald Laffinger stepped inside, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "This," he said, gesturing around the bunker, "is what I meant by the expensive price for information. Now you'll have all the time in the world to learn the truth as you spend the rest of your lives in this cozy little bunker with the survivors." "Survivors," David repeated, his voice breaking on the word. Laffinger ignored him, turning to address the women. "Ladies, meet your new roommates. I'm sure you'll have plenty to talk about." He started to leave, then paused at the door, a cruel smirk on his lips. "Oh, and don't get any ideas about helping them escape. You remember what happened last time someone tried that, don't you?" The women visibly flinched at his words, a shared tremor of remembered trauma passing between them. As Laffinger's footsteps receded, Marissa could hear his muffled, angry voice speaking to someone on the stairs. "Damn dancing man. Get me a call with Matthew and Caraway." The name sent a jolt of ice through Marissa's veins. Caraway, the coach. He was involved. Once he was gone, Marissa turned her desperate gaze back to the women. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, "help us untie these ropes." The women exchanged uncertain glances. Then one of them, a woman with dark, haunted eyes and a familiar curve to her jawline, stood and approached. She turned her back to them, and Marissa gasped. Through the thin fabric of her shirt, a lattice of raised, pale scars was clearly visible, the brutal artwork of a whip or a belt. "This is what happens when we don't follow the rules," the woman explained quietly. "But please," Marissa begged, tears streaming down her face. "We're looking for our daughters, April and Amber Green. They disappeared 20 years ago. Do you know them?" The woman froze. She turned slowly to face Marissa, her eyes widening in dawning, incredulous recognition as she studied Marissa's features. A single word, a whisper that bridged 2 decades of silence and sorrow, fell from her lips. "Mom!" The single word, breathed into the sterile, underground air, shattered the world. "Mom!" It was a question, a memory, a lifetime of loss packed into a single, fragile syllable. Marissa's heart seemed to stop, then restart with a painful, violent lurch. The face of the young woman before her, though thinned by hardship and etched with a sorrow no 34-year-old should ever know, was unmistakable. The dark, intelligent eyes, the curve of her jaw, it was April, older, wounded, but alive. "April," Marissa sobbed, the name a prayer she hadn't dared to speak with such certainty for 2 decades. David made a choked, guttural sound beside her, straining against the ropes that bound him, his face a mask of disbelief and profound, agonizing joy. Hesitation warred with instinct on April's face for a second. Then instinct won. She knelt, her fingers fumbling but determined, and began working at the tight knots that secured her mother's hands. "We can't make noise," she warned in a desperate whisper. "They monitor this room sometimes." As she worked, Marissa drank in the sight of her daughter. This was the face she had tried and failed to imagine for 20 years. The face of the woman her child had become in the dark. "What happened to you?" she asked, the tears now a silent, steady stream. "Where is Amber?" April's hands stilled for a fraction of a second, a tremor of remembered pain passing through them. "Only 3 of us survived," she said, her voice hollow. She nodded toward the other 2 women, who were now watching the reunion with a mixture of hope and terror. "Me, Kira Thompson, and Hannah Lee." The names of the other survivors struck Marissa with the force of a physical blow. Then April's voice dropped even lower. Amber and Lily were killed. They tried to organize an escape years ago. They made us watch, to teach us a lesson." A sob of pure, unadulterated agony was torn from Marissa's throat. The fragile hope of finding both her daughters, a hope she hadn't even realized she was still harboring, was brutally extinguished. David wept openly beside her, his broad shoulders shaking with a grief that had been held in check for 2 decades. April, her own eyes shimmering with unshed tears, finally freed Marissa's hands before moving to untie her father. As David pulled April into a desperate, crushing embrace, Marissa explained everything in a torrent of whispered words. The suitcase, the earring, the waitress, the ranch. "The police know we were following a lead," she assured her daughter, clinging to the thought like a life raft. "They'll come looking for us when we don't return." April shook her head, her expression bleak. "Mom, if they're as good at covering their tracks as they have been for 20 years, no one will find us here. This bunker is soundproofed. We've screamed for help 1,000 times. No one ever hears." Just as the last of Marissa's hope began to drain away, a new sound intruded, faint, muffled, but unmistakable, shouting from above. Then another sound, sharp and percussive, that could only be one thing: gunfire. Hope, fierce and violent, surged back through them. David, now free, grabbed a metal food tray from the kitchenette and began banging it rhythmically against the metal pipe they had been tied to, the noise deafening in the confined space. They all joined in, shouting for help, their voices raw. Minutes that felt like an eternity passed. The gunfire above eventually fell silent. Then, miraculously, they heard movement on the stairs, followed by voices calling out, "Police! Is anyone down there?" They screamed back, their voices a unified chorus of desperation and relief. After several tense moments of drilling and prying, The electronic lock disengaged with a loud crack, and the heavy steel door swung open. It revealed not their captors, but several police officers in full tactical gear, their weapons drawn. As they were led up the stairs and out of the barn, blinking against a sun they hadn't seen in years, the survivors were met with a scene of controlled chaos. The ranch was swarming with police vehicles and ambulances. Several bodies, covered with sheets, lay on the ground. Near the main house, Marissa spotted Detective Holbrook, his face a mask of grim determination. Beside him stood Chris Delaney and the waitress, Sarah, their faces flooding with relief at the sight of them emerging safely from the barn. Gerald Laffinger and his men were being loaded into separate police cruisers, their reign of terror over. "Detective," Marissa called out, her voice breaking with emotion as she held tightly to April's hand. "We found them. We found our daughter." Holbrook rushed toward them, his expression a mixture of shock and profound relief. "We've been searching for you since the hiker and the waitress reported you missing," he said. Then his face hardened. David told him everything, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Vincent Carraway. He's behind all of this. He took the girls." The detective turned to a nearby officer. "Radio all units. Priority 1. Locate and apprehend Vincent Carraway. Consider him armed and dangerous." The monster who had stolen their daughters, who had murdered Amber, was now the one being hunted. It wouldn't bring back the dead, and it wouldn't erase 20 years of horror. But as Marissa held her surviving daughter, a woman she had mourned for 2 decades, she knew it was a start. The 20-year silence had finally been broken, not with a whisper, but with the righteous thunder of justice.